welcome to our next session of for the Nuvik African Studies session. We're really excited to have Benedetta Rossi talking to us today, and I'll hand over to Alan. Oh, just a few housekeeping notes before we start. We are going to be recording this session, so we can send a link out to you. Also, if you do have any questions, there is the question box there that you can use, or the chat box if you want to make any comments, and we will have the opportunity to discuss some issues with you throughout the session as well. If you're not happy about being recorded, then please just keep your microphones muted if that is a problem. So I'm going to hand over to Alan to introduce Benedetta.
Okay, so I'm just going to briefly introduce Benedetta. Benedetta will be talking to us about the medieval state and political structure and dynastic rule in West Africa today. And if I introduce her very briefly, I'm sure she would be better at doing this herself. So Benedetta is a social and labour historian of Africa, trained as an anthropologist. Her work focuses on 20th century Africa and global labour history and slavery and other forms of unfreedom, migration, planned development, age, gender and sexuality. Okay, and Benedetta is currently working on her second book, Slavery and Abolition in 20th Century Africa. Obviously, at the end, there'll be some questions and answers, but I think it would be really interesting to hear about the work that Benedetta's doing. You know, we're going to have a Q&A at the end here. Okay, so Benedetta is a widely published author of her own books and also edited volumes and a number of articles. And she's currently Associate Professor of, I think, African Studies or History at University College London. So introduce Benedetta. She'll be speaking to you now. Okay.
Alan, thank you so much for this introduction, and good evening, everybody. It's really nice to be with you. I was hoping I was going to see all your faces and I was going to be able to talk to you while looking at you. I would like to find out more, if possible, about your own interest in African history. So Alan has told you a little bit about what I'm doing. We'll have a chance to speak more about what I know on African history, and at the end you can ask me questions. As Alan said, I'm a specialist of slavery within African societies and history, but that's not the focus of my chat with you today. However, before I start talking about states and empires and their power in African history, I would find it really helpful. I don't know if you can answer my questions, but I would find it really, really helpful if someone could tell me something about what do you teach, what are you able to teach of African history in your own courses? I understand you are mostly teachers. Why are you interested in African history? In what ways? And how do you think these sessions can be helpful to you? And having a sense of where you're coming from and what your interest in the history of Africa is can really help me pitch what I have to say and get a sense of where you're coming from. So could I have just briefly an idea of, you know, where does Africa fit in the work of everybody in here?
I think on behalf of Alan and I know that there are a few other people in the same position, and we're actually looking to introduce the OCR unit for medieval African kingdoms next year. So at the moment, to be honest, I've not really studied, I'm an early modern history specialist, but I haven't really studied anything related to the African continent during that period, although I have kind of a vague knowledge of it. So for me, it's really about kind of understanding the kind of broader general themes, and also thinking about how that kind of interconnects with Europe as well.
Okay, so thank you so much. This is already helpful. So would you say that as we stand, like up until now, there's no African history taught at school at all?
Not really, no. At the moment, I think there are very few places that are actually offering the African A-level unit with OCR.
Yeah.
And I think that's increasing, which is good news. But I think that in terms of, I think the later periods, in terms of like colonialism, decolonization, those kind of subjects are taught, but the medieval African units, not so much at A level. I think a little bit more further down the key stages. So like key stages 3 and 4, I think there's more of a focus on African kingdoms there.
Okay, I see. And okay, I think that's, what do you think? Of course, I'm asking you, but maybe you have a sense of the others. What do you think these sessions, what do you hope to get from this session? What would you like to us to discuss? What can I tell you that can be helpful to you today and then in the future?
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, it's about developing more subject knowledge, first of all. But it's also getting a sense of how historians work in the field and the particular challenges faced by historians of medieval Africa particularly, and looking at some of the kind of archaeological work surrounding that too, and the oral histories, and a sense of some of the challenges as well that might be associated with teaching in this particular field. And I'm also really interested in finding out more about how universities approach this as well, and the kind of resources that you use and the way that you approach this subject with your students.
Oh, that's fantastic. No, it's really helpful. And I'm actually I'm glad you're telling me this, because although I didn't know much, I think then what I've prepared should respond to your expectations. So let me try and share my screen. Sorry, this is not the first page, but can you all see my screen now?
Yes, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, so great. Let me then say a few things about the themes that you've asked me to reflect upon with you, which is state political structure and dynastic rule in African history, starting from the earliest periods. And I perhaps want to start with a reminder that there is a very frustrating sense that Africa has no history. And this is deeply rooted in European culture and European sense of its own history. So as you've said, there is hardly any African history taught at schools today. It's just considered like a place that has nothing to offer from a historical perspective. And this is immensely frustrating. It goes back to some of the fathers of European philosophy. So Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who sort of in the early 19th century. So we are, in the phase that when just after the death of the transatlantic slave trade, that's when he's writing, and the sort of before the growth of European imperialism that at the end of the 19th century would lead to the occupation of Africa. So that's when a thinker, a philosopher as important as Hegel said that Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit, but just an entire continent just written out of history. Now, and if you may think that this is what was being said, in the, let's say, first half of the 19th century, and that these ideas may have changed, you will be surprised or horrified, depending on where you stand, by finding out that President Nicolas Sarkozy of France gave a speech in Dakar on the 26th of July, 2007. And the speech is long. I've only quoted a small passage, but it actually gets worse, which was basically repeating Hegel's ideas of Africa as a place without history. And in an English translation, Sarkozy just travels to Dakar and says, the tragedy of Africa is that the African has not fully entered into history. The African peasant, who for thousands of years have lived according to the seasons, whose life ideal was to be in harmony with nature, only knew the eternal renewal of time, rhythmed by the endless repetition of the same gestures and the same words. And he goes on arguing that Africa essentially has no history worth of the name. And this kind of statement attests to immense European ignorance about Africa's complex history, long history. Well, of course, the history is as long as everywhere else. But there still is a deeply rooted idea that we really don't need to know about Africa's history because there isn't much to know about. I remember when I started a job in Liverpool, I took a cab on arriving in the town, and the cab driver asked me what I was doing. And I said, for a living. And I said, well, I teach African history. And he said, well, is there any African history? So, you know, these ideas are deeply rooted. The idea that this place is just a place where, you know, farmers just wake up, go to bed, but nothing really that changes the world. And these ideas have to be challenged. They have to be challenged because, first of all, they demonstrate we're very ignorant about the history of Africa, but also because it's as enriching as the history of any other continent, and because it could also help us make sense of present day African societies that are our close neighbors here in Europe. So just a snapshot, and I confess, this is a map taken from Wikipedia. I'll have more detailed maps, but this just gives you a very quick sense of important centralized polities that are well known today to historians. For each of the colored spots on the African continent that you see on this map, and this is a diachronic map, so many of these spots were not contemporary. These are political formations that existed at different moments in time, but these are important centralized political structures, empires, states, kingdoms, sultanates, emirates, for example. And there is a whole historiography for each one of them in terms of, let's say, if I had a PhD student wanting to conduct research on any one of the political formations you see represented on this map, I'd probably tell them, this is too huge. You simply can't manage in 5 years to cover everything there is to be read about this entire polity. Let's call it polity for the moment. Tell me in which sub-region of the Sungai Empire, of the Hausa states, of the Sokoto Caliphate, of the Empire of Kanem, and tell me very specifically which decades of that history do you want to study. So this suggests that when it comes to centralized empires, we actually have quite a substantial historiography, but it is a very specialized historiography. It is a historiography that exists in universities, and that it's difficult to sort of, I found it difficult to convey it or to see it represented and discussed outside universities. We can discuss why this is the case. There's one point I want to make. So I have been asked to talk about states, political structures, and dynastic rules in Africa. And the thing I want to really underline here to you as teachers of African history is that perhaps one of the most interesting aspects of African political history is that states, that is centralized political formations where power was centralized in the hands of one particular ruler, are actually just one part of African solutions to the problem of government. So the states that you see represented in color on this map are perhaps a real minority of the political structures that at any one time up until the end of the 19th century we find in Africa. And if we think of the earlier periods, we actually won't have a lot of evidence on non-centralized political structures for reasons that I'm going to discuss in a second. But as we move closer to the 19th century and for the 19th century, we actually get this picture of an incredibly diversified African political world. Imagine a kind of boring Europe with mainly kingdoms and empires in the 19th century, with this very kind of homogeneous type of political structures. The problem of government is solved pretty much with the same kind of political structure in Europe in the 19th century across Europe. In Africa, the problem of government is solved in an incredible variety of ways. Usually, historians of Africa differentiate between centralized polities and decentralized political structures. And I know you've asked me to talk about the centralized ones, but I actually want to try and convince you when you're in class with your students to just make them feel curious about a continent where societies were really inventive when it came to political structures. Because beyond kingdoms, emirates, sultanates, chiefdoms, maybe you can think of them as centralized, and empires, there were decentralized political formations such as lineage-based societies, of which a particular type is segmentary, unilineal segmentary systems, political systems. I'll give you an example later. There were age-based societies, clan-based societies, there were hunter-gatherer bands, there were societies organized in houses. So you actually have human society gave itself very different types of political structures, and side by side, or sometimes interspersed within these sort of blots of color that you see on this map, you had a lot of societies who spoke languages that were not the same as the ones of their rulers, and which followed different criteria of, how do you govern society? Lineage-based political structures are extremely important, and they are often very decentralized. And you have different clans where the elders of certain lineages of the clan, usually the male elders of the clans, are a kind of group of leading representatives of a particular society that speaks the same language and that shares a certain culture. And those structures, these political structures, were always represented. So at the same time as there was such a diversified system of political organization within Africa, Africa was also part of some of the major dynamics in world history. So, and from the very beginning of the spread of Islam, Africa, which is so close to the Middle East, becomes one of the major centers of Islamic society, religious and political structures. So Islam isn't just a religion. Islam is a system of law, and it's a political system in the sense that Islamic political systems resemble each other. They're highly centralized. The idea is that you have a caliph, and under a caliph you have sultans, and under sultans you have emirs. And you find this particular type of political structure reproduced in all the parts of Africa where Islam establishes itself as the dominant religion. And as you can see from this map, at a very early stage, the Islamic world under Muhammad in the 622, 632 Christian era is just the Arabic world. But already 10 years later, you actually have an expansion into Egypt and all the way into Tripoli. And then you have about 20 years, 30 years later, the whole of North Africa is actually Islamic. So this means, what does this mean? This means that North Africa, which had been levitating around, it had been sort of converging around, gravitating around the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. So around the Mediterranean, and there were important axes of trade, in particular slave trade, but not only slave trade of white enslaved that were traded across the Mediterranean and into Africa, and vice versa, African enslaved persons traded the other way around across the Mediterranean. Well, this whole system that had been inherited in North Africa from the Roman Empire and its fall changes with the spread of Islam, and there's a sort of the whole structure of politics and the legal system and the norms and values change as they become reorientated towards the value of Islam at this stage. And Islam continues to expand southwards, and by the 13th century we do find that almost the whole of North Africa and a large part of West Africa has already been exposed to Islam. So in all of this system, the spread of Islam creates connections between the non-Islamized North Africa and the rest of Africa, which isn't converted yet. And one of the important connections, these connections are defined by ecological complementarity, and that has little to do with Islam, and it was always there. The fact that North Africa has a certain ecology, and then you have a sort of desert stripe, and then you have a Sahelian and a savanna stripe, and that there's complementarities between the goods of these areas, almost suggests or imposes trade links, so that the products that aren't available in the north can be acquired from the south through trans-Saharan trade and vice versa. And these exchanges are at the heart of important trans-Saharan trade networks. The nature of the environment in all of these places shapes in part the type of social and political organizations of the societies that we find there, and it shapes the political political strategies of the states. Now, the first African states that we start having more information about is the so-called Kingdom of Ghana. And I am glad that at the beginning you told me that you're interested in the type of sources we have. So the further back we go in time, the fewer the sources. And for the medieval period, most of the sources that historians of Africa have at their disposal are Arabic sources, because most African societies did not have written languages. And so, as I am sure you will have discussed with Toby, while we are sure they would have had a very complex and rich cultural life, they would have lacked, they wouldn't have written things down so that we would be able to access information from their own perspectives. But we do have an important amount of sources by authors who were writing in Arabic that are accessible in translation. And there are a number of publications where you can actually get their accounts of the political system that they either witnessed or that they found out about from travelers. And I'm going to just give you a very quick sense of what these sources sound like. So what do we know about the so-called Kingdom of Ghana? Now, we have a very important source, which is Al-Yaqubi, who in his Tarikh, written in the late 9th century Christian era, describes there is the Kingdom of Ghana, whose king is also very powerful. In his country are the gold mines, and under his authority are a number of kings. Among them are the kingdom of M, there is an illegible word there, and the kingdom of Sama. Gold is found in the whole of this country. So here we get a very short description in the work of an Arabic author about the existence of a kingdom, actually probably what in English we would call an empire, because there is a king who has under his authority a number of other kings. So perhaps we are entitled to translate this as empire, but there's a lot of debate over the terminology we use and to what extent is this terminology Eurocentric by establishing connections between political formations we don't know so much about and political formations that are very much more familiar to us from European history. But here you already have the idea of a very wealthy kingdom. However, an archaeologist, Nicholas Gestrich, warns us, and I just left the warning here, but I could, this kind of warnings multiply for each of the sources. This one is just very clearly phrased. We must note that by this point, by the point we get to read this particular extract about Ghana, this text has undergone a number of distortions because Al-Yaqubi would have interviewed North African travelers who would have explained what they heard about Ghana, and then he would have written something down, and then we would have translated it into English. And so we are, what we know about the Kingdom of Ghana is mediated by a number of interpretations, which perhaps are misinterpretations. How would have the people who lived in that kingdom represented their political structure is certainly a question, and historians who work on these early stages would certainly do benefit from both archaeology and epigraphy. We have, however, for Ghana, a more important account by al-Bakri, a Muslim historian who lived a little after al-Yaqubi in the 11th century and who lived in Andalusia. His accounts, his history is based, he would have had interviewed travelers in North Africa, but probably he wouldn't have been in North Africa himself. So it's kind of things he heard. But we have this fascinating account, which says the city of Ghana consists of 2 towns situated on a plain. One of these towns, which is inhabited by Muslims, is large and possesses 12 mosques. In the environs are wells with sweet water from which they drink and with which they grow vegetables. The king's town is 6 miles distant from this one and bears the name of Al-Ghaba. Between these 2 towns, there are continuous habitations. The houses of the inhabitants are of stone and acacia wood. The king has a palace and a number of domed dwellings, all surrounded with an enclosure like a city wall. In the king's town, and not far from his court of justice, is a mosque, where the Muslims who arrive at his court pray. Around the king's town are domed buildings and groves and thickets, where the sorcerers of these people, men in charge of the religious cult, live. In them too are their idols and tombs of their king. These these woods are guarded and none may enter them and know what is there. In them are also the king's prisons. If somebody is imprisoned there, no news of him is ever heard. So this is a very famous account amongst historians of medieval Africa, because what it suggests is, first of all, you have in one of the most important kingdoms that is a gold-producing kingdom. So you can imagine this would have been a wealthy polity. And in this wealthy polity, there would have been trade opportunities. And so you have represented a kind of bipolar city, a city with 2 poles, with 2 centers. One center, which is Muslim, and it's where the Islamic travelers reside, and another center where the king himself resides, but this king is represented in the 11th century as not yet converted to Islam, but carrying out trade with Islamic trans-Saharan traders who reside in kind of their quarters. He is not only not converted to Islam, but he has his own religion, his own diviners. There are woods where particular rituals are carried out. So here we find a complementarity and an integration of a non-Islamic political power in a centralized, very wealthy kingdom, and sort of still interacting, perhaps on a constant basis, with Muslim traders and clerics. A very interesting type of formation that also suggests a degree of tolerance. However, this is written in Arabic by someone who would have been a Muslim. And so you can see already in how he describes the ritual and the cults, sorcerers, that he is representing the religion of Ghana, the indigenous religions of Ghana, as somehow less civilized than the Islamic one. Where is this Ghana kingdom? Now, the Ghana kingdom, you can see the map on the left, would not have been in contemporary Ghana. It would be much more sort of internal and north of, basically, it is, you can see the Senegal River right to the south. So it's where Senegal and then in the north, Mauritania are and Mali are. So we are closer to contemporary Mali, part of Senegal. And it's kind of misleadingly perhaps called Ghana, like the contemporary country, but it's not the same region. You can see that there was, and then the two major states that we hear about from the Arabic sources accessible to us are the Kingdom of Mali and the Songhai Kingdom. And you can see the other two maps there that suggest that these three political sort of major kingdoms or empires, I mean, empire is probably a better terminology, these major West African and medieval empires follow, sort of succeed one after the other. They are partly integrated. It's the same people who are living in the same regions, but someone else from a different group, speaking a different language, seizes power and defeats the former rulers, and then continues expanding north, south, and east. And the largest of these empires, as you can see in these maps, is the Songhai Empire. We know not so much about Mali. We have an important description by Al-Umari, who is writing in the 14th century and spent years in Cairo, where his father was working for the Mamluk. This is a sort of Islamic political structure. We can discuss it later, but the Mamluks were originally from the east and outside of Africa and had been a slave corps, slave military corps, which had been integrated as kind of warrior slaves in the Sultanate in Cairo until they revolted and seized power. And then you have a series of Mamluk dynasties ruling this part of the African Islamic world in what today is Egypt. But if we go back to Mali, the Empire of Mali, so we have a number of descriptions, and I haven't gone into detail. They are broadly accessible, and in particular the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa to the sort of Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca of Mansa Musa is one of the most reported descriptions that a number of Arabic authors write about. And the idea is that this king, Mansa Musa, was so wealthy that in crossing Egypt, he distributed so much gold that apparently there was an inflation and the price of everything was there was an inflation followed his travel across Egypt. So this vision again of a West African sort of absolute king who travels accompanied by an enormous group of dependents and who distributes gold and buys as he travels, continues producing this image of a very wealthy Africa in the 13th and 14th century. Let me now move to the third formation. I want to say a little more and go more into detail later on other states in Africa, which are closer to us historically. But with the Songhai Empire, so with the decline of the Mali Empire, of the dynasties that are ruling the Mali Empire, another group in the region seizes power. And this is a Songhai group speaking Songhai languages that are still spoken in this region and moving eastwards, the center of the power of this sort of mega empire that has now taken place. We know an awful lot about the Songhai Empire because instead of relying on little extracts from this sort of general collections of travel news collected by Arabic authors, we, for the first time, have a sort of serious book-length study, a book authored by a Sadi who was born in Timbuktu. So he is a Malian, essentially. He is from the region. He's a historian writing his own history, but he's not quite writing exactly his own history because he was born in 1594. And at that stage, the Songhai Empire, which was a short-lived empire as an independent empire, had been defeated by the Moroccan Sultan. And so the Sultan of Morocco had literally defeated in battle the ruler of the Songhai Empire and had therefore become the overarching ruler of Songhai, imposing a dynasty known as Arma rule. So a different bureaucracy comes into place and controls Songhai. And it is at that moment that this native historian, who feels like he is in a certain sense a descendant of the independent elite of Timbuktu and of Mali, the Songhai elite, who is born only 3 years after a foreign power has conquered the Songhai Empire and has imposed its bureaucracy. And so he grows up in a world which is dominated by the originally Moroccan pashas, as they're known, the pashalik, but these pashalik who are ruling as an Islamic emirate, the former kingdom independent empire of Songhai, start marrying into Songhai and Tuareg society, into local societies. And so they become very mixed as a group in terms of their intellectual and political projects. And so we have this incredible work, again, that you can read in translation. You can suggest to your students to read it. You can read it yourself. It's quite accessible. There is a published book in English. The translation in English is by John Hunwick, one of the great Arabists in the US. He died recently. And it's a very accessible, easily accessible book. The Tarikh al-Sudan, in 38 chapters, which tells the history of the Songhai Empire from the mid-15th century to 1591, when the Songhai Empire falls and to the Arma of Timbuktu. And then it's written up until 1655. So you can see how enormous the empire was. It stretched more or less from you can see it stretched from Senegal to Mali, modern day Mali, to almost half of Niger, parts of Nigeria, Burkina Faso. So it was a mega empire, but it had been defeated. And in this book written by a local historian, you have plenty of detailed information, sultan after sultan, pashalik after pashalik. This is what the Songhai capital would have been. Obviously, this is a modern day picture, but this was a region at the center of, at the threshold between a more humid area where agriculture and riziculture were possible and the desert. And so it was a kind of entrepot economy between the products of the desert, of the pastoralists, of livestock, that kind of world, and a more settled and fish and the fishery and the fishermen, which were particular groups. And then you had other groups that were farmers. And these were often different ethnic groups who spoke different languages and were sort of all integrated in this kind of great empire, but also, so they were part of an overarching hierarchy, but they also had their own internal hierarchies, their own chiefs, their own ways of making sense of power. And so these are complex political structures. I'm not going to go into deeply into the main work on Assadi's text, but we do have a recent historian based in Birmingham who wrote a really important work, which is an analysis of Assadi's historiography of the Songhai Empire and of the Pashaliks' rule. Okay, I want to now move quickly to the last part of what I wanted to say, which is going back to the idea that political centralization was not everything in the African continent. And a large number of these Arabic authors constantly sort of build on a distinction which they see as fundamental between desert civilization and city civilization, urban town civilization. And the main distinction here for the whole of West Africa, the Sahara, Sahel, then you have North Africa and then the savannah. So, you know, is between the Bedouins, as they call them, the Berbers who inhabit the desert and who travel across it and who are fully nomadic and have very different political structures than the centralized empires and kingdoms that revolve around particular capitals that are a center where a king resides, where the king has his bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy can collect taxes, that bureaucracy can impose order, can defeat enemies if they rise against them. But at the same time in Africa, you constantly have different forms of political structures. Already Al-Yaqubi talks of the Sanhaja, which are essentially sort of the ancestor of today's Tuareg, as they have no permanent dwellings. It is their customs to veil their faces with their turbans. They do not wear sewn clothes, but wrap themselves in lengths of cloth. They subsist on camels. They have no crops, wheat or otherwise. And then again, Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest African historians, in the Muqaddimah, he distinguishes between civilization may be either desert, Bedouin civilization, as found in outlying regions and mountains, in hamlets, near suitable pastures in waste regions and on the fringes of sandy desert, or it may be sedentary civilization as found in cities, villages, towns, and small communities that serve the purpose of protection and fortification by means of walls. So already in the sort of first centuries of the second millennium, you have a very strong sense in West and North Africa that the political world is divided in two big sort of systems. One, the city, the centralized kingdoms, empires. Sometimes in the Islamic world, they take a particular Muslim sort of character. Or you have these segmentary systems, which are lineage-based, where you don't have large densities of people, you don't have walled cities. You have these groups of persons constantly moving and not residing all together, but functioning politically by recognizing an apical ancestor, the same ancestor, and then they form groups of people who descend from a particular ancestor. This is known as a segmentary lineage system. And so particular clan leaders are then succeeded, if they die, someone else in their family will replace them, and you have different major clans. So in the Tuareg world, here you can see how these nomads are scattered everywhere in Africa, and they have not a centralized political system. These aren't kingdoms. These are people moving around, recognizing each other by reference to belonging to a particular lineage that has one ancestor that somehow gives a character to the whole structure. And by the sort of 19th century, these groups are divided into what are known as confederations of clans. You have the Kelahaggar in the north, the Kelajer, the Yolimid and Kelaparam and Keldinik in the south, further south even the Kelgres in northern Nigeria, in what today is northern Nigeria. So they're very broadly spread, and they function according to completely different rules than centralized states. They're still collecting taxes. They're highly hierarchically stratified. And I can tell you more about them later. The last two brief points I want to make are about more recent political formations. So I had plenty of sources here to talk about these Tuareg, because at some point, these nomadic Tuareg that are lineage structured decide apparently in the 16th century to select an arbitrator who is a sultan, who is based in Agadez. And so you get this incredibly strange political formation of the Sultanate of Agadez in the middle of the desert, with a settled sultan who doesn't belong to any of the main clans and who is somehow arbitrating among or across these different clans of nomadic confederations of clans, of nomadic groups. And so you do have a mixture between a centralized political system and a system and political systems that are all Tuareg, that use the same language of politics, that use the same bureaucratic system because they partake of the same political culture, but which are segmentary, nomadic, and have areas of influence. At the same time as we know that you have this world of Tuareg people gravitating around the Sultan of Agadez, we also start having sources on things like the Hausa city-states. And now, what are the Hausa city-states? And this is another question that has been fascinating historians, because we start hearing about the Hausa city-states quite late historically. Our first sources are, here I have some, we have a very vague reference to what we later come to recognize as Hausa in the 11th century. But then it is really from the 16th century that we hear the names of the Hausa city-states in our main Arabic sources, in some Italian sources at the time, in a very important source, which is Leo Africanus, who is this sort of Muslim intellectual who is enslaved and brought to the Pope of Rome in the middle of the 16th century. And so he writes in Italian a history of Africa that is an extremely precious document, because it gives us a real snapshot of African history in the mid-16th century. And in the first group of authors, the earliest authors who talk about the Hausa world, which covers what today it's Niger and northern Nigeria, we don't really get a single name. We don't even hear Hausa. The term is not used. What we have are names of the famous Hausa walled cities, like Kano, like Zaria, Zegzeg, Katsina, like Gobir, or Wangara. And so we get this sense of these city-states, almost in the Greek sense of the terms, these major walled towns with their kings, Islamized on the whole. We have evidence from Ahmad Baba's account that that was a Muslim world. So the Hausa society by the 16th century had converted to Islam. And so, but their political organization was only in part the typical Islamic one. And so in the 19th century, we're going to get a major reformist jihad by the leader of the Sokoto Caliphate, the person who would become the leader of the Sokoto Caliphate, that Usman Dan Fodio, who sort of rages against the Hausa kings, calling them apostates and immoral leaders, and sort of conquers the whole region and the various Hausa city-states and unifies them within a major sultanate or caliphate. Some called it caliphate, but nowadays I think most historians would call it a sultanate, which has sort of stricter Islamic, which follows stricter Islamic rules. And we have an enormous amount of data on the Sokoto Caliphate, because the leaders, his family, and his intellectuals write extensively about law, the political organization, taxation, slavery, trade. They're very prolific writers. And of course, by now we are in the 19th century. And so the place is also traveled across also by British and French explorers who write their own accounts. And we also have sources in Hausa transcribed in Ajami, that is in Arabic, or later in Roman alphabet. So at this stage, come the 19th century, we do have a huge amount of sources from different perspectives. The more Islamic ones, the African but less Islamized, the European travelers that give you perhaps more information on the sort of everyday life of simple people. And then you start having proverbs and fairy tales and songs. I'm aware of the time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to take any questions you may have.
Thanks, Benedetta. I think there was a few that have come through, and I think Alan might also have a couple of questions that he's posted there. Alan, do you want to go through the questions that have been asked? Do you want me to start off? Okay, so the first question was really about a question that I had, which was thinking about like whether centralization led to more or less conflict in kingdoms, and how and with what effectiveness did kingdoms control their populations during this period?
Okay, obviously, to speak at a sort of African level, it's difficult, but definitely I wouldn't say that centralization led to more conflict. You have to imagine lineage-based political structure as complex as centralized kingdoms. But what the difference may be is that with centralized states, you have a standing army, so a greater potential for for violence, for the control and the technology of organized violence around the state. You have specialized sort of army, soldiers, mercenaries sometimes. You have a whole sort of more complex bureaucratic structure that can report back on what's going on in different parts of a centralized kingdom. As the lineage-based societies are often smaller scale societies as well. And what you can imagine are sort of clan leaders, perhaps constantly at war with each other. And so in this sense, not necessarily less conflict prone, but this is a smaller scale conflict where members of the same clan mobilize to defend each other or to aggress the enemy in a very frequent sort of standing system of war and kidnapping of enemy women, inserting them into their system. So it's often a very confrontational political system, the lineage-based one. It's just the power of the state is not there in the same way.
Okay. Thank you, Benedetta. Can I ask you a question? It's taking this forward a little bit, but what issues did non-state-based societies present to eventual European colonial rulers? Does it present them with opportunities? Did it present them with difficulties? How do you control these societies? And also, did they impose structures on those societies that were alien in terms of leadership and organization?
Sorry, African or European?
Well, European actually, but we could look at Africa as if you're looking at the spread of those Muslim empires. Did they, maybe they're two sides of the same coin?
Look, the lineage-based societies, the decentralized political systems are incredibly interesting because they're so diverse. And if you're thinking in terms of the Tuareg system that I mentioned toward the end of my chat, or if you think in terms of even Fulani societies that again are spread across what today are 3 nation states. So these are major societies that take a certain type of political formation. They can and have been at moments sort of waging war against centralized societies successfully, they are often highly militarized. The segmentary lineage structures like the Tuareg or the Fulani are highly militarized segmentary systems where you can have an alliance of the military caste that is following the kind of leadership that attacks centralized societies successfully, subjecting them for a period to their rule and taking tribute from them. So if you take a part of what's the north of the Sokoto Caliphate, at some point you have this major Islamic empire that in the beginning of the 19th century had defeated and conquered and subjugated the previously independent Hausa states, centralized Hausa city-states. You have this big empire, but the north is basically, the north is controlled by Tuareg hierarchies. And what these decentralized political systems do, they defeat small-scale chiefs that are between centralized and decentralized, because they are like, the chief would be a primus inter pares. And then they basically collect tributes from these small-scale chiefdoms. And so you have a situation where to the south, you have a major empire. To the north, the Tuareg segmentary system, so the Tuareg confederations of lineages, win against local smaller chiefdoms, integrate them in their own decentralized hierarchies, and collect taxes from small-scale chiefdoms. And this world eventually encounters the European world. And so you get, in the very beginning of the 20th century, you get the very end of the 19th, very beginning of the 20th, you get the British and the French conquering both systems and integrating them into their colonial empires. It's not exactly a conquest, it's a very strange conquest. But when they arrive, it is a lot easier for the European colonial armies to defeat the small scale, if you want, military system of decentralized lineage-based societies that are really small-scale clans. It is more difficult to defeat the major decentralized systems like the Tuareg, who wage an incredible resistance against the French, because that's the ones they confront mostly. And they are defeated very late. You know, after the empire is there, they continue to resist. And then they also, the British defy the Sokoto Caliphate in battle. They have a superior military technology. So to some extent, Europeans come in and their military technology is such that they can defeat all of the African formations. But some, it's harder to struggle. They have greater losses, and the decentralized, it's a highly diverse system. It's, you know, you have to think from really small scale to really large scale, but decentralized.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question from Michael Hughes, who's one of the audience. So, and he's asked, I can't quite see all of the question because the screen's sort of chopped. So Karina might be able to help me. Yeah, could you do that?
Yeah, so Michael's asked, in terms of the agency versus dependency debate, how important was Africa in relation to the outside world in causing the collapse of these kingdoms?
It's a really good question. It depends on what period and what region. To some extent, if you're going to study African history, that's, there within Africa, you always have kingdoms, some of which are Islamic, and therefore we should call them emirates and sultanates. And then you have less centralized societies that sometimes become integrated in these large kingdoms and empires which are African. And up to the mid-19th century, this world is largely independent, autonomous, politically independent. You have very small bits of the continent, the African continent, that are under direct European control up until the 1870s. Come the 1880, the growth of imperialism means that essentially European empires divide amongst themselves at a table in Berlin and Brussels, two major conferences. They just decide who's going to invade what, and then they arrive in Africa, and within 20 years, the entire African continent is politically under European control, because none of the African rulers, be they small scale or leaders of empires or of emirates and sultanates, successfully resists the military technology of European empires. But European rule is really short-lived, because for the bulk of Africa, we're talking of roughly 60 years of European colonization. That's for the greatest part, and I'm not talking of South Africa, slightly longer period, and for certain parts like Ethiopia, it's a much shorter period. But African agency is always there, even under colonial power, if you want. There are African political structures that continue to inform how people think about politics. The European empires and administration obviously influences African political systems and structures, but in 60 years, and there's only, there are relatively few, these European colonialists. If you're a historian of Africa, let's say, even in the colonial period, you certainly cannot presume to not study African political structures, systems, and cultures, because that's what's in the mind of people for those 60 years, for the bulk of the continent, that they are subjected to European rule. I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you very much, Benedetta. Yes, that was excellent. Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. And I'm sorry that we've run out of time. And if anybody does have any other questions, then please feel free to email us at the African Studies Centre. Our details are there, and I'm sure Benedetta will be happy to kind of respond to any of those questions at a later point, if necessary. So I just want to say thank you very much for taking your time out today, to you, Benedetta, but also to the people who attended today, who I know will be following this up in future sessions as well. And when we finish our sessions, it would be good for us all to have a discussion about what we've got from this, and to also give you some feedback in terms of like our thoughts and ideas going forward. Thank you very much, Benedetta. We really appreciate it. And I think Alan's got just some details about the next session that's taking place. So Alan, could you just give us some details of that and tell people how they can sign up, please?
You're muted.
Oh, is he still muted? Hold on one second. Let me just unmute him. I think he should actually be listed. Okay, so I think hold on a second, let me just unmute here. There we go. Okay, Alan, sorry, handing over to you. The joys of technology. Apologies about this, everybody. Okay, details are on the African Studies Centre for the next session. I'm not sure why we can't hear Alan at the moment, but if you look on the African Studies website, and you'll find details about the next talk that's happening, which will either be, I think it's in a couple of weeks' time. So please do sign up for that. And we'll look forward to seeing you there. And thanks very much, Benedetta. We look forward to continuing to have these conversations with you in the future.
Well, thanks to you for inviting me. I do hope this has been useful. It's very, it's such a complex material to go through in less than an hour. But I hope it has at least given you a bit of a sense of what kind of sources, what kind of debates, what kind of political structures, what kind of dynamics, and how interesting it would be to teach more of this at school. So
absolutely, and I hope it's inspired people to want to go and teach more of it and to learn more about it. It definitely has with me, and I think that
thank you so much.
going from a ground zero, I don't know very much about this. I thought that was a fantastic outline, and it's really inspired me to go away and to do some further research, and also given me a good idea as a teacher of the kind of sources I can use and of how to approach those as well. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again at some point soon, hopefully.
Bye bye. Thanks to you.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you, everybody.